This is the so-called Saudi Arabia of the North, the Alberta tar sands, an oil deposit so rich it's transformed Canada into a world energy superpower. But there is a catch. This oil is heavy. It's thick and tarry and all mixed up with sand and clay. Scraping it out of the earth and separating out the valuable stuff is a massive job that goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It may not be pretty, but this is prosperity, the engine that drives the Canadian economy. It's also what's turning Canada into one of the biggest polluting countries in the developed world.
For a long time, most people thought none of this was even possible. Squeezing the heavy oil out of all that sand and clay is a dirty, expensive process, and for decades, most oil companies scoffed at the idea. Today, with the price of a barrel of oil approaching $100, there's a mad dash underway to extract every drop possible. Government is clearing the way, and oil companies are making billions of dollars, but neither seems to be keeping track of the staggering environmental costs of a modern-day black gold rush.
Ask Albertans what makes this province great, and not many would likely say money or oil. David Schindler definitely wouldn't. The University of Alberta scientist is world-renowned for understanding how rivers and lakes work. He thinks most Canadians have no idea what's happening north of Fort McMurray.
If I were a millionaire, I would fly every Canadian over the oil sands. And if I were an entrepreneur, I would probably, before I did, buy a whole bunch of hybrid dealerships or Volkswagen dealerships or something, because I think most people would be instant converts. They'd get rid of their SUVs and their big pickup trucks and buy something fuel efficient.
This is what he's talking about. Mines, machinery, and toxic waste. Almost 40,000 square kilometers of northern Alberta, an area larger than Vancouver Island, is already approved for development.
The history of the oil sands.
Simon Dyer of the environmental research group Pembina Institute calls it a stampede.
You have to appreciate that in 1995, Oil Sands, the National Oil Sands Group set a target of achieving 1 million barrels a day of production by 2020. They achieved that in 2004, 16 years ahead of schedule. Yet at the same time, we haven't seen the sort of environmental management frameworks put in place to protect the environment.
This is the first casualty of that oil sands stampede. Hundreds of thousands of hectares of northern boreal forest already being stripped and drained to make way for open-pit mines.
I don't think most people realize we're talking about an intact forest that has never been disturbed before, still with its full complement of wildlife species, woodland caribou, black bears, and wolves, and a real mixture of spruce and aspen, and then wetland areas. So I mean, nationally significant forest lands we're talking about here, and that often gets lost in the discussion.
The forests are just the first natural resource consumed in the pursuit of crude. Oil sands companies are also licensed to draw almost 350 million cubic meters of water from the Athabasca River each year, twice the amount of water used by the whole city of Calgary. Then there's the natural gas. All that water gets heated before it's mixed with the tarry sand to extract the oil, and to do that, companies burn enough natural gas each day to heat 3 million Canadian homes. Still, as voracious a consumer of natural resources as this industry is, it is what the oil sands contribute to the environment that worries critics even more.
The oil sands in 2007 produced about 40 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is the same as about 10 million cars in Canada. So it's a huge impact. And oil sands are likely to be responsible for almost half of Canada's greenhouse gas pollution increases in the coming years, which, as we're seeking to reduce emissions, we're obviously taking us in the wrong direction.
The Alberta government recently passed a law requiring companies to cut their emissions intensity 12.5% per barrel. But as the number of barrels produced goes up, so do emissions. Greg Stringham, a lobbyist with the oil industry, says Intensity-based targets, as they're known, are fair. He compares it to trying to improve the miles per gallon you get in your car.
I mean, intensity growth is really like miles per gallon on a car. From the production end of emissions, about 20% comes from production, about 80% from consumption. So treating it very similar to consumption side of things, we want to improve our mileage per gallon. But we're not going to say you can't stop driving a certain distance each year.
But those emissions could skyrocket if the industry meets its production goals. At a meeting in Houston, Texas in January of 2006, representatives of the Alberta and federal governments met with their U.S. counterparts. They talked about how to get ready for production that could reach 5 million barrels per day. According to the minutes of the meeting, Canadian governments have already gone a long way to coordinating and streamlining the environmental and regulatory approvals, but more needs to be done. Since that meeting, Albertans elected a new government, but it seems the old priorities haven't changed.
Well, it comes over time.
Rob Renner is the new environment minister.
Well, let's be very clear. Alberta is not about to close the door to further investment. My job is to ensure that we have sustainable investment, that we protect our environment, and that's exactly what I'm doing. But I don't have a 6-month time frame or even a 6-year time frame. The time frame tends to be one that is future oriented. We want to make sure that we have an environment and an economy that in both cases are vibrant, that we can pass on to our children and our grandchildren.
Tailings ponds will almost certainly be part of that legacy. Already covering more than 80 square kilometers, these vast toxic lakes contain a slurry of water, sand, and oil and naphthenic acids, the leftovers of oil sands mining.
It's a real toxic soup of things, and then of course there is some residual oil in there, which is why as you fly over you see an oily sheen on everything, and also why any duck that lands on them never takes off again.
Oil companies fire noisy propane cannons to scare birds away. They also experiment with ways of helping toxins settle to the bottom faster, but critics are skeptical.
What the companies hope to do is to slowly separate some of the fine suspended material and incorporate that into reclaimed dry landscapes. And then with the most watery, fine, mature tailings, at the end of the mine life, pump those into a deep pit, top them off with fresh water and walk away. It's never been proven, and it's a real risky process, and I think could have long-term ramifications for Albertans.
And the other claim they like to make is that eventually this water will lose its toxicity and these will be lakes, but they're going to have this toxic sludge at the bottom, so there'll be lakes without bottom organisms, which means lakes that won't support fish. Even if that happens, so far the tests that have been done indicate that if there is a decreasing toxicity, it's very, very slow. But my guess is that they, at the size they are now, they can't reclaim them. They're huge, and there's no known way to do it.
So even if they can reclaim them, what you're talking about, best case scenario, is that you're going to have these giant dead lakes.
I would say so, yes.
Many think that tailings ponds present the industry's greatest environmental threat, an ever-present risk that someday the toxins in them could seep into the groundwater or the adjacent Athabasca River. A minor amount of seepage is already allowed. And that has the people who live just downstream in Fort Chipewyan concerned. They're mostly Cree, Chipewyan, and Métis, and for more than a century, this corner of Lake Athabasca has given them food and water. The lake still looks unspoiled, but those who know it say it isn't. That its pristine appearance masks a host of contaminants, all associated with heavy industry. Ray Ladouceur is a Métis trapper and fisherman. His great-grandfather, Joseph Cardinal, fled here after the Riel Rebellion in the late 1880s. Ray is the fourth generation to live off the land here since, and possibly the last. He thinks neither the lake nor the land can support another.
Oh, there's a lot of changes, a lot of these fish are, you know, especially when they're commercial fishing in the springtime of the year, they're deformed. This one of my friends caught a jackfish, a northern pike, with 2 jaws.
2 jaws?
2 jaws, yeah.
What kind of changes have you seen yourself in the fish?
Oh, a pickerel like this, with twisting faces, with crooked tails and humpback, and sores on them. Some of them even grows moss that they're rotting alive. No. Same with the whitefish. We catch whitefish, it's so skinny, and a lot of them's got sores and got big lumps on them.
Scientists think the defects are widespread and caused by contaminants in the lake, mercury, arsenic, and toxic chemicals associated with oil production called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. Dr. Kevin Timoney of Treeline Ecological Research was hired by Fort Chippewa's Health Authority to test water and sediment and to review decades worth of data other scientists have compiled too.
There seems to be a very clear set of links between what's coming down the river, getting into the sediment, getting into the wildlife, and diseases that are being observed in the human population.
In Fort Chippewa, death by cancer is rampant, including death by an extremely rare cancer of the bile duct known to be associated with PAHs and oil pollution. One study found that the rate of cancer in the population here was 30% higher than in southern Alberta.
A quick overview of what we found.
That's why so many turned out for a town meeting recently to hear what Dr. Timoney's tests revealed.
For people who eat locally caught fish, the health risk to you is greater than the Alberta government has told you.
Many here are worried, and Dr. Timoney says they should be. There are unsafe levels of mercury, arsenic, and PAHs in the fish of Lake Athabasca, and he says the Environment and Health Department's assurances that everything's fine are just wrong.
I mean, I could pull out the report and I can show you instance after instance after instance where they're over acceptable regulated guidelines from the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. It's a fact. I don't know how they could maintain that unless they're simply badly informed.
A lot of people in Fort Chip suspect a cover-up is going on, that government doesn't want any information that's accurate to get out. What do you think of that?
I'd say that's a very plausible explanation because I can't think of any other way to describe it. The data are there, and there are many people who are in the Alberta government who are intelligent and hardworking civil servants, and I think they're probably troubled at not being able to speak out because the information control within the Alberta government is world class in terms of what gets spoken to the public.
Environment Minister Rob Renner says the province closely monitors water quality in the Athabasca River and lake. Does your department investigate at all the kind of the deformities in the fish and those kinds of things that the natives in Fort Chippewa are talking about? I mean, pushed in faces, humps on the back, cysts, that kind of thing. These are showing up in the fish there. Are you guys looking into that?
No. Not directly. What we're doing is continuing what we believe is our responsibility to have ongoing monitoring of the quality of the water. Anecdotal evidence of deformities are not restricted to the Athabasca River.
That's not much comfort to people like Ray Ladouceur. In fact, it reinforces his belief that the oil sands development is happening too fast. He knows the oil companies aren't the only ones polluting, but says that industry is so big and so dirty, it could push the environment here to a tipping point. He sees the signs everywhere.
After a rainstorm, any puddle that you see, it's yellow right around it. Sulfur. My water barrels, yeah. After a big rainstorm.
You can actually see the yellow of the sulfur.
Yep, yep.
Is that right?
Yeah.
When we come back, critics say Albertans are paying a huge environmental cost in order to feed oil-greedy neighbors to the south.
Most of the product is going across the border to feed the U.S. machine. It's not doing Canadians any good.